Confronting the climate crisis will require a global effort. Events such as the annual United Nations Climate Change Conferences, including the one currently underway in Glasgow, Scotland, acknowledge that. But how well do they and other efforts do at bridging the wide gap between the industrialized North and the global South to find solutions that work for all? Joining us now on that from COP26 in Glasgow, Chido Muzondo, Policy Advisor, International Institute for Sustainable Development. Harjeet Singh, Senior Advisor, Climate Impacts at the Climate Action Network International. Maisa Rojas, Associate Professor for the Department of Geophysics at the University of Chile. And in Waterloo, Ontario, there's Sarah Burch, Canada Research Chair and Executive Director of the Interdisciplinary Centre on Climate Change at the University of Waterloo. And we're grateful to you four for joining us here on TVO tonight for a obviously very timely and important conversation. I want to start by just bringing up a map, or I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to do it, to remind everybody that the Global South is a term often used to identify lower-income countries. Noted on this map, which I'll describe for those listening on podcast, it's in the red. Generally speaking, they're south of the equator, these countries, and the Global North, in blue on this map, generally equated with the developed countries. Obviously not a perfect delineation. Australia and New Zealand are part of the Global North, even though technically they are in the South, but you get the idea here. Now, you are all from different parts of the world, so let's start with some examples of how climate change is affecting the various regions that you come from. Harjeet, why don't you start us off? The effects of climate change in India are what?
Well, we are already seeing huge challenges when it comes to climate change impacts, and India is highly vulnerable. It has 7,500 kilometer long coastline, and we have seen devastating floods, cyclones, and droughts, which has affected millions of people. And as we speak, every year, millions of people are now being pushed out of their homes, and the kinds of disasters people are facing, one after the other, they get very little time to recover from the previous one, and the next one hits them hard, and really makes them far more vulnerable to future disasters.
Chido,
and
how
people
about...
are losing their homes, incomes, crops.
Understood. Chido, how about in South Africa?
Thanks. So in South Africa, mostly climate change is affecting two key things: higher temperatures and a reduction in rainfall, which impacts already depleted water resources. And this has contributed and is contributing and will continue to do so to droughts in the country. South Africa is also highly dependent on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture and forestry. So an increase in temperature and reductions in rainfall threaten the productivity of these sectors.
And Maisa, how about in Chile?
Yes, actually quite similar to South Africa. Drought is definitely the worst impact. We have had for over 10 years now something that we call a mega drought. If you add then hot temperatures, loads of weather that gives fire propensity as well, and our mountains with glaciers, we are also losing the water that we're getting from glaciers.
And Sarah, would you say that we are experiencing climate change in the same way that countries in the Global South are, those of us here in Canada?
Not in the same way, no. So Canada won't escape unscathed from climate change impacts. And we know from recent assessments that, in fact, climate is warming twice as fast here in Canada as it is compared to the global average. However, the most important thing to keep in mind is that climate change puts stress on top of other pre-existing stressors. So we have the financial resources, the institutions that we need to grapple with those changes as they unfold, those heat waves, floods, fires, and that sort of thing. So we're not without impacts, but we have those crucial resources for responding to them.
Understood. Let's bring up another graphic here so that we can review with our viewers and listeners some of the historical carbon emission records of some of the bigger players on this. So again, Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring this up. The United States has, of course, emitted more carbon than any other country to date. It is responsible for 25% of historical emissions. Next in line are the 27 countries of the European Union, plus the UK, which we now have to say, which are responsible for 22% of global CO2 emissions. Meanwhile, China's historical contributions are estimated to be around 12.7%. By contrast, the contributions of African countries, 3% combined, relative to the continent's population size, has been very small. And similarly, India at 3% and Brazil at less than 1% have not been large contributors to global emissions in a historical sense. But let's pick up the conversation there. Chido, let me ask you, is there any debate that the countries that have historically put the most CO2 into the atmosphere are not the ones that are feeling the impacts of it the most?
So no, I mean, there's no debate around that. That is a fact, and the graphic that we saw on the screen puts that plainly. And I think the thing that we need to be looking at specifically at the current COP is conversations around what the global North can do to help the global South to cope with the impacts of climate change, given the fact that most developing countries or countries in the global South are least equipped to deal with some of the effects, and as you said, also sort of have contributed less. So definitely, that's a fact.
And Maisa, let me do my due diligence here, and I'll ask you the same question. Is there any debate about this anymore?
I don't think there is, although remember that the latest IPCC report says that climate change is affecting every region of the world. So that means really every inhabited regions and even regions where we don't live as humans. The difference is, as was said before, is that the hazards are there, but the vulnerability and the exposures are different. And that's why the Global South requires help to cope with those impacts.
All right, Sarah, when we go back to that chart, there's no question the more developed countries have been more responsible for historic emissions to date. But when we look at recent emissions, how might that chart look different if we took that into account only?
Well, it's changing quite rapidly. And so I think we need to add some nuance here. One is, where is Canada in that historical picture? And of course, because we have a fairly low population, we don't rank among the highest historical emitters. But per capita, we're actually number one. If we gather together the emissions we've produced historically and divide it by the number of people who live here, we're unfortunately have the distinction of being on the top of the heap. But now emissions are shifting. Emissions in the global North are actually relatively level and even declining, and the proportions are almost flipping. So whereas we did see the global South responsible for about a third of total emissions and the global North 2/3, that's almost entirely flipped now. But that's for a couple of particular reasons, and that is the enormous emissions from China and India. So the emissions from those countries have been growing rapidly and are now going to be responsible for a large portion of climate change impacts going forward.
Okay, we had a little trouble with Harjeet's line, so I want to circle back and just ask him that last question again. And that is, any debate in your mind, Harjeet, that the countries that have historically added the most CO2 to our atmosphere are actually not the ones where the impacts are being felt the most?
Well, as we have heard, it's a reality that they are less vulnerable, and developing countries, because they do not have sufficient resources, there's high level of poverty and population, and geographically also they are disproportionately affected. So it's very clear that countries who are least responsible are affected most, and they have least resources to cope with the climate impacts.
Having said that, we are hearing a lot of people these days saying things like, we have to hold India and China responsible for the fact that they are adding much more CO2 to the atmosphere now, maybe more so than the developed countries. And I guess my question for you is, do you think it's fair that India and China be lumped into that same bucket together?
Well, what the rich world is ignoring the legacy that India and China got. So they had resources such as fossil fuels, and that's the kind of model West promoted all over the world. So India, for example, followed that model and is stuck with reliance on fossil fuel for its economic growth. And we also need to recognize that the industrialization began in India only in late 90s, unlike rich countries who have been polluting for more than 100 years. And when we talk about climate change that we are facing now is not because of emissions that are coming from India and China. These are past emissions, and we know climate works on a lag system. So the emissions of rich nations of Europe and the US are primarily responsible for the climate crisis, but that doesn't mean that India and China should not reduce their emissions. In fact, the most potential that we have to reduce emissions is in these major economies, but that cannot happen overnight. And we also have to make sure that the solution that we adopt is just and fair.
Right. So, Sarah, how do we resolve that? Because, of course, the developed countries have had decades and decades of head start to pollute the atmosphere, get their economies into a position where they're much stronger than the developing nations, and yet now they want to put pressure on the developing nations to get their act together. That sounds like a conundrum that'll be very difficult to fix. How do we do it?
How do we do it? It is a conundrum, absolutely. But I think that there's something we're missing here, which is that, first of all, we've had these decades to develop the technologies that we need to accelerate progress towards this low carbon resilient future for everyone that we're aiming for. So we have those technologies. So that means that the collaboration between North and South is not just one of financing adaptation, of financing responding, protecting communities to the impacts of climate change, but also accelerating the uptake and the spread of those low carbon technologies that, I should add, offer co-benefits. So they don't just reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but moving away from coal, for instance, creates enormous public health benefits, cleaner air, this kind of thing as well. So those benefits are crucial to recognize.
Maisa, how do you see this conundrum that I've just described?
Well, let me say again something about the IPCC report. I was an author on the IPCC report, Working Group 1, and it's that the future is in our hands, and it's the future emissions that will add to global warming. So there is absolutely no doubt that what we have to do is reduce emissions, and we all have to do it. I would say that for this to be felt as just, as was said before, and I think that is a framework that I completely agree with, is that let's help developing countries to get on the ship, the boat, or whatever you want to call it, the train of renewables, of a clean economy, of a green economy. Let's get them first. That would be just, but don't. There's no time to delay those actions.
Well, let's pursue that then, shall we? A clean and just energy transition is where I'd like to take our conversation now. And let me just put this background in place before I pop a question. The background is this: Canada, the US, the UK, and 21 countries just joined a deal to stop new direct public financing for coal or oil and gas development by the end of the year 2022 and to shift investment to renewable energy. Okay, when it comes to ditching fossil fuels, how can the global north ensure that countries that rely on them for economic survival are able to make the transition successfully? Chido, you want to start us off?
Sure. I think COP26 is a global solidarity test, with countries from the global north needing to deliver their fair share of climate action and support to the global south in leapfrogging to low carbon and resilient development pathways. It's been said before that aside from climate finance, there is technology that might be in the north, intellectual property, whatever the case might be. I think part of these forums is to create the pathways for that sharing to take place. As a quick example, aside from the big deal you just spoke about, last week and the first week of COP, a new partnership called the Just Energy Transition Partnership between South Africa, the UK, France, Germany, and the EU will provide loans and grants totaling $8.5 billion to help South Africa transition away from coal-fired plants. And South Africa is a country where 90% of our energy comes from coal-fired plants. So that's an example of, okay, it's not necessarily technology transfer, but it's a very practical example of the kinds of bilateral, multilateral partnerships that can come out of COP to help the global south to transition. It's a very small example. Of course, South Africa is just accounts for one country, but I think it's a very encouraging sign of what can be done.
Well, Chido, let me do a quick follow-up with you. You mentioned 90% of the electrical power in South Africa is coal-fired generation. Without help from the global north, could South Africa transition off that much dependence on coal?
Yes, South Africa could, but we wouldn't be able to transition at the rate needed to keep in line with the Paris Agreement commitments. So I think it would take us longer than what we've committed to, and we would probably contribute to warming above 2 degrees Celsius. So it can be done, but not at the rate needed without finance.
All right. Harjeet, how about for India? Without help from the global north, could India make the kind of transitional changes necessary to meet targets?
So as Chido said, the same situation is in India, where bulk of our electricity and energy comes from coal. And India also cannot turn the tap off in a matter of days or months. So the transition has to be fair. And Steve, as you said, we have to talk about not only energy transition, but energy access for all. And unless and until we make sure that the transition is just and fair, I'll give you an example. India needs at least $5 billion investment in wind and solar infrastructure and energy storage to reach the target of 450 gigawatt, which now India has increased to 500 gigawatt. And the current level of investment needs to be tripled at least to reach that kind of target. So unless international finance is provided, unless there are deals between the government and the international community, it's not going to happen. And that's where there is a role of Global North to continue to provide support and meet their responsibility. You can't just now blame India, South Africa, China for their reliance. We need to provide support as well.
Maisa, what would the countries of Latin America be looking for in terms of helping ease this transition in?
I guess there are a couple of challenges particular to South America. Well, in the case of Chile, we don't have fossil fuels, which for a long time was a really terrible situation. Now it seems like it's lucky because it has helped that transition towards renewable energy to occur really fast. But I would say in general, many of the other countries will require help in doing that transition fast towards renewable. The beauty about renewable energies is that every country has them, right? Every country in the world has a potential kind of renewable energies. And the other thing, I guess it's important, it's the case of Chile and it's Brazil as well, is the deforestation, that we stop deforestation. So that's another area that also requires important support.
Maisa, can I just confirm what you just said? You have no more you're all renewables now, is that right? Or nuclear? You're all 100% green?
No. Sorry. The thing, we don't have fossil fuels. I mean, we don't have coal or petrol or gas in our country. So we have not exploited them. So we have to buy them. No, we have coal as well. We still have coal power plants, but as part of the carbon neutrality commitment of Chile, these are going to close in the next decade.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes more sense. Now, Sarah, let me ask you this. Do you believe that the Global North has either a moral or ethical obligation to help the Global South with this transition?
So I think, if the question is, does the Global North have a responsibility to help clean up the mess we've made and to be a force for improving conditions globally and advancing us collectively towards this, low carbon resilient future? Absolutely. Does that give us a free pass to take this kind of paternalistic framing to climate change and prescribe the development priorities of countries that are not our own? Absolutely not. So this is where I get worried when we talk about responsibility of the Global North as a way for the Global North to actually force the Global South to develop along a particular pathway that it itself has not designed.
Can you just help me understand what you mean when you say a paternalistic framing of this issue? What does that mean?
Well, it means saying that these particular technologies rolled out at this pace is what we've decided for you, South Africa, for you, Chile, is the best path for your country. And, Harjeet mentioned the issue of energy access. That is a crucial dimension of addressing poverty and improving access to education that will be part of development going forward. And that has to proceed in a way that is low carbon and contributes to these climate change targets, but is absolutely justified.
Harjeet, from what you've seen so far, does the global north, do the countries of the global north look like they are prepared to help with dollars make the transition that we're talking about here?
Not at all, Steve, and that's the most frustrating part. We should have seen that money flowing a long time back, and we have reached a stage where we are now already seeing how climate disasters are hitting. It is happening because rich countries did not provide resources. On one hand, they did not reduce their emissions. They did not provide support to developing countries to bend the curve. And even now, as we can see that the money that was committed way back in 2009, is not being provided, and whatever money they claim they have provided is not a real money. It's full of loans and guarantees and not a grant that would have helped developing countries put that architecture in place so that they could leverage and attract trillions that are needed. So we are not looking for billions, we need trillions. And we are not saying that the entire set of trillions have to be grant, but that $100 billion that we talked about is supposed to be the seed money that will help developing countries make that policy shift, which will eventually bring those trillions for the transformation that is needed.
Chido, just before I get you to address that, let me in fact put the background again in place, because it was more than a decade ago that at the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen, that the rich nations made a pledge of $100 billion a year to help the less wealthy nations by the year 2020 to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate further rises in temperature. So, in your view, Chido, what's the status of that pledge today?
Well, Harjeet touched on it. I mean, that pledge has not been met year on year. And the money that has come forward has trickled in. It's not enough for what is needed. So it really has been disappointing to say the least regarding progress on those commitments made at Copenhagen. And we're hoping that what comes out of Glasgow will be more actionable and will be targets that countries of the global global north, or developed economies, however you want to refer to them, will meet and will stand by. But Harjeet basically said it all. We're very much behind on the agreements made at Copenhagen.
Well, Maisa, I should ask you, do you have any legitimate reason to feel more optimistic coming out of COP26 that the global north will change its attitude on this?
That's a difficult question, because I really don't see the reason why this has not happened. We have seen the trillions that have been invested in the recovery after the pandemic. It would just require a fraction of that to help developing countries to do their part for mitigation. But I think, and this is very important as well, this is not just about mitigation. We have at the same time the opportunity and the need to build resilience. And that part, which it's less quantifiable, it's not tons of carbon, I think has been for too long sort of the small brother or the small sister, or the more ignored part of this discussion. And I think that if there's something that the pandemic has shown us, it's that the whole world, and it's not just the developing world, really requires resilience to all these shocks that are occurring now, and they will continue to occur, as we know that when further warming, every bit of warming will continue to increase those impacts.
All right, but Sarah, I suspect the finance ministers of the global north are probably arguing something along the lines of this. We've just been through 19 months of the worst global pandemic in 100 years. We have spent trillions of dollars developing a vaccine, getting the vaccine out there, putting income support programs in place for people in business to make sure that they could withstand the ravages of this thing. And now you're after us for trillions more for this, and we don't have it. What's the response to that argument?
The cost of the pandemic will pale in comparison to the costs of climate change. That would be my response to that. And out of the last week, we have seen an interesting announcement, I think, from our Minister Guilbeault here in Canada. We've just recently doubled Canadians' contributions to this $100 billion dollar pledge to adaptation finance, which, to put a bit of a critical lens on that, there have been assessments that have said that even that is still a quarter of our fair share as Canadians to adaptation in the Global South. Nonetheless, we have this $5.3 billion commitment by the Canadian government, which now 20% of that has been tagged for biodiversity protection and nature-based solutions, which has been a really interesting turn of events, I think, in this COP, this renewed focus on the value of nature.
Well, Harjeet, they're talking money this week. How optimistic are you that they're going to find a way out of this?
Well, honestly, I'm not, because we have seen they had a clear opportunity to meet the $100 billion commitment well before the COP. They could not deliver. As I said, they are still close to just $80 billion, and we know that money is missing, and that is causing a lot of distrust between developed and developing countries.
Okay, I want to get one more item on the table here, at least one anyway, before we wrap up, and that is bias in scientific publishing. The UK-based climate science website called Carbon Brief published a study last month highlighting what looked to be some pretty severe publishing bias when it comes to researchers in the South. And again, Sheldon Osmond, if you would, let's bring this chart up here. The Carbon Brief study looked at 100 of the most highly cited climate research papers between the years 2016 and 2020. And here's what they found. Fewer than 1% of the authors were based in the nations of Africa. Only 12 of the papers had a female lead researcher. 90% of the scientists affiliated with institutions from North America, Europe, or Australia. And none of the papers was led by a scientist from Africa or South America. Now, Maisa, can I get you in here? Why does this matter?
Sure. Well, as I just mentioned, I was a coordinating lead author of the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC that was published in August. And there is indeed, you can see of the 240 authors, they are from 64 countries, but there is still a very important underrepresentation of women. So we were only 28% of women, and from the authors from the Global South as well. Why is this important? Because almost a third of the report has actually regional information. You do want to give the decision makers information for particular regions, but it is the authors that have the best information on their own region. And if they're not represented there, then it makes it very difficult that we can assess properly what is happening in every region of the world. So I would say it's one of the problems.
Chido, could you follow up on that? What do we lose if we have as unrepresentative a sampling as I've just described when trying to report these facts?
I think we lose, as has been said, I think we lose the nuances that come from local researchers. I think it's also very problematic to have work on the Global South that is done by European or North American researchers, because by and large, they might live in an area for a specific time or do research in a specific area, but I feel like, you lose sort of the colors that come from having somebody who is local really to that region.
We've got just a few minutes left here, and I do want to get one last thing on the record, and that is Greta Thunberg, as she often does, has made a lot of headlines around the world by saying that already, even though we haven't got to the finish line yet, but already COP26 is a failure, and it was just a PR exercise. And in fairness, the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is on record as having said, we made some progress, but not nearly enough considering the task at hand. There are a few more days still to go before COP26 wraps up. So far, and Sarah, why don't I start with you? How well have the needs of the Global South been addressed as you've looked at events taking place at COP26?
Well, to speak to the issue of whether or not I think we can already say that COP26 is a failure, I mean, my resounding answer to that is no. So while I think the other guests can speak better than I can about how access was facilitated by scholars from the Global South and by civil society organizations from the Global South at COP26. The purpose of COP26 is to convene leaders from around the world to ratchet up ambition, to compare who's saying they're going to do what, and to raise up that ambition level, which has been happening. Then those leaders have to go back to their home countries and embed this in domestic policy. We don't have a global government. We don't have a framework by which we can require countries to meet these targets and penalize them if they don't. That has to happen at home. So we have seen some of that come out of COP26, and I think that ambition ratcheting up is a really important thing.
Harjeet, how well have the issues championed by the Global South been represented at this conference?
Well, it has been quite a struggle. And, apart from talking about mitigation, I think other important issues are finance, as we have been discussing. But one thing which has become extremely important in this COP is loss and damage, because we are not talking about future. We are talking about climate impacts that are hitting us now. And as I said, millions are being displaced. They are losing their homes, but there is no system that is available to provide them resources now. So even at 1.1 degree of temperature rise, when impacts are happening and the global system is not ready to support them, how do we trust leaders that they are going to meet their commitments of staying below 1.5 or net zero? And UN system is not only about solar panels and wind farms. This system is about people, and people who are suffering, they're not getting any support. I think we need to keep reminding, in the next few years, if we have the whole world running on solar, but disasters are not going to stop. Unless we create a system where we also protect people from these disasters, and some disasters are inevitable and people are going to be impacted, we have to give them a helping hand. And that's where this COP is failing, and the money that should have been committed by now for addressing loss and damage hasn't come through. We are seeing some progress in the text. We have few more days to go, but leaders have to step up and rich countries have to stop blocking creation of a new stream for addressing loss and damage.
Chido, in your view, is the Global North stepping up?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think not enough is being done. I think global leaders of the developed economies are saying the right things, but as Sanjeet said, that's not being reflected in the actual text coming out of the negotiations. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. I wouldn't be as pessimistic to say this COP is a failure. I don't think so. We still have a few days, but more needs to be done.
I'll give the last word to Maisa.
Okay, let me try to end up with a bit more positive ideas here. Again, another quote from the IPCC report on the 1.5 report, and it's that every decision counts. I think it is important to remember that, of course, COP is about governments, and it's incredibly difficult to agree for 200 governments to do something. But there's a whole movement and the whole action going around what is called non-state action, so everyone else, basically. And when you look that sphere of everyone else, the private sector, region, city, there's a lot happening there. And that makes me in particular makes me feel very, very helpful. I mean, the two champions alliances, a Race to Resilience and the Race to Zero, and the financing as well are something that I'm very helpful to see that the world is already moving, even if the governments are a lot slower.
We will keep watching with terrific fascination, to be sure. I want to thank the four of you for taking time away from your responsibilities, both over there and here in the province of Ontario, to join us on TVO tonight. Sarah Burch, Harjeet Singh, Maisa Rojas, and Chido Muzondo. Thank you so much. Be well, everybody.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.